Hi, and welcome back to Rose Connections. My name is Janet Rose, and every month I walk us through three main topics that get us a little bit closer to becoming heart-centered leaders. And under a heart-centered leadership model, I want to help us create a more loving, sustainable, and just world. I want us to be able to understand one another. I want us to be able to understand ourselves. And I want us to be able to show up and shine brightly in our most authentic ways and really owning our vulnerabilities, owning our strengths, and bringing out the best in others. And today is a radiant resilience topic, which covers exactly that. Being able to show up, shine a light, and bring out the best in others, and bring out the best for others as well. In particular, I want to talk about this idea that has been floating around in my mind since I was a teenager, which is that so much can be communicated through silence. But there also comes a point where our silence can become violent and can help perpetuate violence. And so in particular, I want to talk about that particular topic today of when our silence becomes violent. So let me distinguish real quick. The silence that I'm talking about is not the same kind of silence that you have when you get into a meditative state and you are listening to your body and you're listening to your heart and you're listening to your soul and you're listening to the collective universe. I am not talking about that kind of silence, which is also stillness. However, that silence communicates a lot. Anyone who has been in that meditative state, they walk out of there with a heightened level of wisdom, with a heightened level of knowledge, at least about themselves, if not about their role in the world. And in fact, if you look at my Radiant Resilience videos, that's going to be, I'm going to be integrating some meditative topics into that. That's not what I'm talking about. Nor am I talking about the silence where you are sitting there with your partner of 10 years after they have just lost their loved one and you're holding their hand and you're silent out of respect for the grief that they are having. You're just holding space. You're just being present. I'm not talking about that kind of silence either. That silence still does communicate a lot, and it communicates empathy. It communicates concern. It communicates unconditional love. And there's nothing wrong with that communication at all. But that's not the silence I'm talking about today. The silence that I'm talking about is the I don't want to rock the boat type of silence. It is white silence. It is bystander silence. It is every family has its secrets kind of violence. All of those kinds of silence contribute to violence. And in fact, on that last one, I even said the word violence, not just because it rhymed, but because every family has its secrets is its own form of violence itself, because that type of family secret keeping can cover up abuse and child neglect and sexual assault. And so obviously I just kind of want to start there, because when we are covering up for past harms, when we aren't speaking and naming what happened to us or our loved ones within our own families, we are contributing to the ongoing violence of that secret keeping. Because very often that secret keeping is used to manipulate people. Very often it'll be, shh, this is just our little secret. And that can be so damaging to the person who's sitting there with the confused emotions, with the disrupted responses, to tell them to be silent about that, to tell them that they have to keep that a secret, is denying that the experience ever happened at all. It's not allowing them to find what comfort they might need, or what clarity they might need, or what peace they need after we have introduced something disruptive to their system. Very often, silence is the tool of an abuser. They effectively silence their victims so that they never have to be held accountable. Silence can also enable abuse in the workplace. for example, when we don't want to speak up about, say, safety violations because we are afraid of rocking the boat or making the boss mad at us or losing our jobs. I'm not saying that these things are not legitimate concerns or fears, but what I am saying is that very often those legitimate concerns and fears prevent us from actually making things safer and making things better. Because if we don't put our employers on notice that there's a problem, or that we're witnessing discriminatory behavior, or that sexual harassment is happening on the job, or that this safety procedure is not being followed and is putting people at risk, then we are essentially communicating that we are tolerant of that kind of disruption to other people's lives. We are tolerant of discrimination. We are tolerant of safety violations. We are tolerant of unethical behavior. When we don't speak up, when we see bad things happening, we are communicating to our coworkers, I'm okay with you being abused. I'm okay with me being abused. And I get that there are some legitimate concerns about losing jobs, especially in this economy. And I've worked with economic insecurity for a long time now. And so I understand that impulse. But I am also the daughter of someone who was a whistleblower, someone who saw something that wasn't right and spoke up in front of a grand jury, someone who saw what was happening and stood alone as they retaliated against them. It takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of bravery to speak up for what's right. But one of my favorite quotes from, say, Harry Potter is, there is this concept that we have to choose between what is right and what is easy. Silence is easy. It's easy to stay silent. It is harder to speak up. It is harder to think that you're going to be standing there on your own, all eyes on you, as you speak up against injustices. And it's something that I was taught, specifically trained to do my whole life. Not just from that one experience with my family, but in all the subsequent experiences that I've had too, in leading leadership seminars for National Hispanic Institute, or leading retreats, or speaking up even within my own study group in law school when I saw something bad happening, when I saw all the women in our group being silenced. Because there's another type of silence too. It's the kind where we are actively silencing other people. And that active silencing could take the form of constantly interrupting them, not letting them have a word in edgewise. Like if you've watched the Real World reunion, this is a lot of what was happening between Kevin and Becky in that conversation, in that race conversation, in the reunion and in the original, is that constant interrupting and speaking over someone. It's gaslighting them, sort of like the way that we have seen happen with some of the school shooting victims, say from Sandy Hook, who have been gaslit constantly and questioned as to the authenticity of their own lived experience. It is making false equivalencies and saying, well, what happened to you is just as bad as what happened to me, completely bypassing the actual impact that that could have had on that person, and the fact that these two things are not at all the same. It can come in the form of trickle-down collaboration, where people collaborate with only those who are also at their level in hierarchy, instead of those who are below them, who are on the ground level actually implementing policies. Violence is also communicated in white silence. When white people are silent about systemic injustice, particularly about Black Lives Matter, or who rewrite the Black Lives Matter narrative with all lives matter, that kind of silence is very literally dangerous. as we have seen time and time and time again. Bystander silence can actually cost lives. Silence about child abuse can cost lives. Silence about poor conditions at a nursing home can cost lives. And just like, we try to hold our national security as a primary priority by saying, if you see something, say something. We are being asked to do that as leaders constantly. If we see injustice happening in our own workplace, we are being asked to step up and say something about it. If we see abuse happening within our own communities, we are being asked to step up and say something about it. Because when we don't, and when we have privilege and power in order to be able to survive speaking up about something, where we're not going to end up homeless tomorrow because of it, we have an absolute duty to do that. We might do it in different ways. We might call people in and have just a one-on-one conversation about something. But if we don't speak up, if we don't put the world on notice, that number one, what is happening is wrong. So that's the first level of notice. And second level of notice is, and that's not okay with me. Because when we are silent, what we are doing is we are saying, I acquiesce, I tacitly approve of this thing that's happening. Silence about kids in cages is tacit agreement with kids in cages, which I don't think a lot of people do agree with that. Silence about injustice allows that injustice to continue. Silence communicates, I'm okay with that. When we speak up, we are instantly saying, I'm not okay with that. The very act of saying, hey, do you think that's even right? At least puts someone else on notice, puts another human being on notice that maybe they should question it. I would rather be wrong in speaking up than not speak up and let wrong things continue. So that's the lesson for today, is just recognizing where our silence, how our silence is communicating for us. And is it communicating what we want it to? When we are sitting there with our loved one holding their hand, what does our silence communicate to them? What does our demeanor communicate to them? What does our tone of voice communicate? Or our lack thereof? So I want to also distinguish very briefly that this is not the same as privacy. This is not the same as confidentiality or a duty of confidentiality, which sometimes can come into play. Sometimes you have to remain confidential. You have to keep information confidential even when it's wrong, even when it contributes to wrongdoing. And I know attorneys in particular, we get faced with that a lot. Social workers get faced with that a lot as mandatory reporters, for example. So there are lines there too about silence, that there are certain silences that we are legally obligated to keep, or else there are consequences. But very few times in our world do we see instances where silence is actually beneficial, other than those ones that I distinguished earlier. What are some other forms of silence that you see, or silencing that you see, that are beneficial, that should be in the toolkit of a heart-centered leader? And which ones should we take out of the toolkit? Personally, I think you know where I stand. Speaking up about injustice in particular is something that should be in that toolkit. We cannot say that we are for nonviolence and allow the violence of our silence to continue. Because not speaking up is allowing it to endure. Not naming it glossing over it, using euphemisms, allows the injustice to continue. In particular, I want us to really think about how we can communicate and seek out information from those who remain silent with us. Because one other thing that is communicated in silence is, especially when you are the leader of an organization or the leader of a group or a team, is when your team members are silent. If your team members are not asking questions, if they're not seeking clarification, if they aren't saying, have you looked at this thing though? That should be a warning sign to you. And you want to understand, and you want to make room for your team to ask questions, to present problems, to help you become a better leader. So leave room for and understand what is being communicated in silence. And also when we communicate through silence, we also increase the chance that we're going to be misunderstood by assumptions, by people filling in the blanks. I want to be the one in control of who fills in the blanks for me, about me. I don't want to be a mystery to other people, because I want to be able to work with them and I want them to know who I am and what they're getting themselves into by working with me. So recognizing when we are receiving silence and what that's communicating. And if it's not communicating something good to you, then you need to speak up yourself and ask that question and say, Tanya, I noticed that you have not said anything this whole meeting. What's going on? What's on your mind? And just leaving that room open for someone to feel like they can speak up. And there are people who are too shy to speak up, and I get that. But this is about even being able to do it on a one-on-one level and practicing that skill of speaking up and not just remaining silent in order to maintain the status quo. That said, I am so grateful that you've joined me today for this topic. Coming up soon on May 12th, I am going to be hosting a Trauma-Informed Care 101 class via Eventbrite. It's going to be offered online on Zoom. It's a 90-minute class. You don't have to know anything about trauma or trauma-informed care to join. We will cover all of that, and hopefully you'll walk out with some practical lessons on some things that you can do to make room for trauma in your own life. For the trauma that you've experienced or for the trauma that other people have experienced, so that we can just treat each other with a little bit more dignity and respect and care and understanding. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about that. Also, on my Patreon page, I am actually going to start dropping some excerpts of the new book that I'm writing, including the Tower book that I'm writing about surviving your Tower moment. So if you've been enjoying any of the Tower series that have been coming up in these videos, then that will be the ebook for you. So stay tuned for that. That's the $8 level of my Patreon. And you can receive weekly divine messages of love on my Patreon as well for the $3 level. So pretty affordable, hopefully different ways for you to engage with me and for us to engage with each other. I want to learn from you too. So please drop your comments, share with me your thoughts. Are there other forms of silence that I'm missing? Are there other forms of silence that are actually really beneficial? I want to hear from you. So thank you so much again for joining me, and I will see you on the next round.